I'm Lori. I'm one of the pastors here, and we're finishing up our do-over series with a special panel. We have Pastor Stan, Pastor Tim, and Jordan. And maybe before we begin, can you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves? What you do?
Oh, okay. I do pastor, but I also do spiritual direction, which is involved in helping people wherever they are in their spiritual life to get unstuck.
Good morning, I'm Tim. I work here, of course, on a part-time basis, and then I'm also a psychologist in a group practice in Santa Monica.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I am a coach. I've been doing that for almost 3 years, and I work with women of color doing general life coaching and career coaching.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't know if you guys all knew that about everybody, but thank you for introducing yourselves. We're going to start with Tim. Can you tell us what's this idea about a do-over? Behind the do-over.
So many of you know that I'm going to call out Kelvin. I've known Kelvin for many years, and he is my basketball coach. And our families go back. What's that? Yeah. Kelvin would help us focus in on defense. And our family knows each other for many, many years. And so when I came here first to Westlight, it was natural for me to go to him and to ask him his thoughts about the culture here at Westlight. And as you know, Kelvin, he's a straight shooter. He'll give you his honest response. And he said something quite wise to me. He says, we're a second chance church. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And he's like, well, a lot of people come here coming from another church or another community, and they just want a different experience. And as I've attended here year after year, I think that was such a tactful and wise comment, because I see it in a lot of our interactions. And as I look around the room, the majority of people here have come from different churches. This isn't your first church. And so I think it's in our culture, in our DNA actually, we are a church plant, right? That we are a church of second chances. And this is why this sermon series is so, I feel, it resonates with a lot of us, because we are a do-over church. The question that we can ask ourselves then is, are we engaging in this church at Westlight on a weekly basis differently than we did in our prior church, or differently than our church in the past in different communities? Or for those this is their first church, even specifically on a week-by-week basis, for example, like today, are we engaging in church in a more effective way than we did last week? Are we engaging with our community or with God in ways that are an improvement on last week? So that's my thoughts about do-over. I think it's very consistent with the DNA of this church. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing. Throughout the sermon series, we've been talking about being all good or all bad, and the benefits of being good and bad. Seeing things that way. But Jordan, can you share what are the dangers of thinking all bad and all good?
I'll try. I think it's interesting, Tim, that you talked about being a second chance church and how Kelvin shared that, because I think for me personally, the idea of trying not to think all good or all bad keeps coming up in the context of thinking about the church and the sermon series specifically, because in the last few years especially, I feel like I've been learning a lot more about the history of not just our church, but the greater church, and a lot of its shortcomings. I think most of us have heard of their churches causing a lot of pain, whether it's from their leaders or just from people, their personal experiences at church. And for me, I was, and I still do get really angry hearing about all of these countless stories of how people have just been, caused so much pain from the church. And I think at first I found a lot of comfort in like seeing other people really angry with me and like hearing all the other stories like, oh yeah, I've like, they did this wrong and they did this wrong. And like, it kind of fueled that fire that I felt. And so it felt kind of comforting, like, oh yeah, other people see this the way I do. But I think like in the long run, even though it comforted me in the short term, I think in the long run, I felt like it didn't actually bring me that much long-term comfort, because in the end, it wasn't actually like more loving and gracious like I wanted the church to be. It just like kind of flipped, and now we elevated another way of doing church versus the old way of doing church. And so for me, that's why it's really tricky to say like, oh yeah, church is all good or all bad, because there's so much nuance, right? Like there are definitely spaces that aren't ready to change, and people do need to set their own personal boundaries and leave those spaces. But then there are spaces like, hopefully, like with this series, where we're able to like engage as a community and take more steps towards healing and love and grace for one another. And so I think that's part of why it's like really difficult to say this way is all good and this way is all bad. And I hope that that's not what you take from this series, is that the way we're teaching you is all good and the way we've been doing it is all bad, because like for all I know, what we're talking about, it could be completely wrong or considered completely wrong in like 5, 10, 20 years, right? Like for me, a lot of the research and background that I've been using in my sermons are from like Western modern scientists and researchers. And so even like in today's world, like maybe people on the other side of the world or from different cultures might feel like that's not right. And so even what we're talking about in this series, right, like we're just trying to help you navigate like our current context and our current culture, right? And I think that's the point of all this, is that we're just trying to do the best that we can in our current day, in our current context. And I hope that we could also give that same grace to like our parents and our grandparents that maybe we feel like we need do-overs from. Hopefully they were all just doing the best that they can too, right? And that's all the grace and hope, love that we could like give to one another. So, yeah.
I think, okay. I was going to say that, yeah, I wish we could just be like, oh, we're just going to think all, good and bad, the and, and, what I'm talking about. But it's a process. And so, like, Stan, you have some comments on what that process looks like. It just doesn't happen overnight.
And so I'm going to go over what was introduced to me as steps to adulthood. But lately I've seen these more as elements of attachment, which is another word for relationship. And all of these steps, I believe, are coexistent, and they need to be revisited. And when we're talking about do-over, I think part of the thing is where we have attached to certain things, they need to be revisited. And so these are some elements to maybe look at in terms of that. So the first element in adulthood is this element of connect. And if you think about it, when a child is first born, the parents want to connect with the child. So you try to find some connection, some common things that you can basically feel like you're one with or have this interaction with. The problem, or not the problem, but what happens is if you stay in that level of relationship, it's always going to be about where both of you have to be the same, or you have to have a disagreement in that. And so the next step is actually to learn about separation. So in other words, that you want the child to be able to see that, well, I'm separate from my parents, or in a relationship that I'm separate from another individual, that I have my own unique types of wants and desires, and I am an individual, and I don't have to be the same as this other individual to be able to have a relationship. So the third thing is to be able to accept the good and bad in ourselves, which basically means that when we see that we are different than somebody else, that we don't automatically think that we are bad because we're different. And so it's a matter of being able to see that, well, there's things that I don't like about myself, and that's okay, because I'm a whole individual and I can learn to accept those things and live through those things. And then the last step is to accept the good and bad in others. So in other words, kind of like what Jordan was saying, a person is not all good and not all bad. That there's a combination or a composition of both. And just like you are not all good and not all bad, other people are the same. And so what we need to do is be able to have the capacity to be able to move in an attachment that allows for these things to be explored without emotional hostility or trying to change someone or shame or all these things that oftentimes when we attach to somebody, that's what happens, that we maybe try to manipulate them to become what we think would be a better person. Or we may have these thinking of, I have to have a relationship with somebody who validates me all the time. And that is a wrong attachment to yourself. So in those steps of maturing, and that's why it's called steps to adulthood, that when you're raising a child, you learn about helping them connect, helping them learn to separate, helping them to see good and bad in themselves, and helping them to see good and bad in others. And that allows them to have at least a basis for a healthy relationship or attachment.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like we've been talking a lot throughout the series about attachment theory. And so my question for you, Tim, is as a therapist, like, how does your field relate to God and the church?
One of my good friends, he was dating this prospective partner. Is that how you say it? And he was telling me about her in a negative light, and it was hard for me to, I'm very close with him, and so I got protective over him. Then I finally met her, and it was hard for me not to be biased, and it wasn't a good start. Have any of you experienced that when you met somebody and it just wasn't a good first impression, it wasn't a good start, right? That's what happened with psychology, the field of psychology, and the church. And it was because of this guy named Sigmund Freud, who was the inventor or creator of psychology, psychotherapy. And he had a Jewish upbringing, and his relationship with religion wasn't positive. So his theory was that religion and faith was an illusion, and he saw it as a defense mechanism. And because of that, the church and psychology had a bad start in their relationship. And similar to what Pastor Stan was saying, the church saw psychology as all bad, and psychology saw the church as all bad. I can give you a history lesson a little bit more. There's this time where another person by the name of Carl Jung came in, and then he sort of provided a corrective. He said, religion is beautiful. It's something that needs to be explored and processed, and something that contributes to our emotional health. So that helped us in terms of the relationship between the church and psychology. Over time, pastors have recognized the value of mental health, and to the point where counseling is very much integrated within the church. A lot of larger churches have lay counseling programs. A lot of larger churches have care ministries, and so people fully understand the connection between mental health or mental wellness, emotional well-being, and their faith now. I often think, whenever I see somebody struggling in their faith, I often ask myself, where are they at emotionally with their mental wellness? And oftentimes, they're struggling, and vice versa as well. So there's definitely an integration and a connection. And thankfully, over the years, there's been a much healthier connection and relationship between the church and psychology.
Stan, can you speak to that? I know you had some thoughts.
Well, I believe that your spiritual life is comprised kind of like your physical life. That in your physical life, you have different systems that operate in your body. You have a respiratory system, you have a circulatory system, you have a digestive system. And if one of those systems is off, it affects all the other systems, even though the primary issue is in that system. So you can't just focus in on one system. You have to have an integration of all the systems to be able to properly identify what the issue is. And I believe that's kind of what Tim was alluding to, is that, you know, we basically put things in silos and not seeing that they actually interact with one another. And as a person that God wants us to grow into, it's about integrating all of those things together and becoming a whole individual. And so I believe discipleship includes looking at your mental health. That if you are struggling, like Tim said, with depression or things that are shame and things, yeah, there's scripture to help, and that's wonderful, but there may be something more that you need. And so a person like Tim can help you have the tools to be able to identify those things. And that's not unscriptural. It was meant to be integrated. I think God gives us all, gave the world this knowledge to be able to integrate it all. And unfortunately, in the past, we haven't done well. I don't know if we're doing better now, but hopefully we are. So.
Thank you. All right, Jordan, can you share with us how we as a community can move forward now that the series is over? We've examined all our pain. Give us some application steps.
Sure, yeah. I thought it would be helpful to give a metaphor to use as a kind of framework for us to keep in mind as we are thinking about next steps and what to take from this. So I thought of houseplants because, like many other people over quarantine, I got really into houseplants really fast, but it's taught me a lot. And even if you own 0 plants or not into gardening, I think most of us know, right? Plants need sunlight and water, they need nutrients and warmth. And so for our metaphor, we're going to say that we are all the plants, God is the water and light, and then the nutrients are like the resources that we've talked about, like our community, different like maybe professional resources, things like that, our faith, things like that. Okay, so even though we know that we all need some combination of those things, the real learning curve is like figuring out how much of each element that we need. And so, for example, like when I was taking care of plants, I was like, oh no, my leaves are turning yellow. What does this mean? And then when you Google it, they're like, it either means you have too much or too little water. And I'm like, no, that's what I want you to tell me. Like, do I give it more or less water? But basically the whole point is that, like plants, we all have unique needs, and there's no like, each person needs this specific amount of devotional and Bible study every single week, right? We all have unique needs that we kind of have to like trial and error to figure out like what rhythm works for us. I think Pastor Stan kind of talked about last week, like the steps that we were talking about, you kind of have to figure out what rhythm we need to, it's not just like steps 1, 2, 3, it's a cycle. So that's the first thing I want us to keep in mind. The second thing is that plants' needs may change, right? So like the clearest example to me is like when you're trying to grow more plants, it's like propagating. So when you trim it and it needs to grow new roots, it needs a lot of light and warmth and just water. You could just grow more roots in water, right? And so like maybe if you're a new Christian, then you need a lot of like support in Bible study and establishing your faith, and you need a lot of God if we're calling that light and water, right? But then over time, eventually, once the roots are established, we move it to soil where it gets more of its nutrients. And I'm saying this because, like, kind of like my Trust in God sermon, right? A lot of times we might feel like, oh, we just need more God. We just need to hold on to Jesus, and that will solve all of our problems. And like I said, yes, there are times we do need that, but also, like, in order to help us really grow and thrive, we need God and other nutrients that we've been talking about throughout the series. And so that's the second thing I want us to keep in mind. And then, like I said, we need God and the resources they've given us to thrive, right? Just like plants don't need just water and light. Some do, but most plants need other nutrients too. So we do need God and all the resources that they've given us. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is that it's okay for us to have needs, right? I think sometimes for me, I'm like really perfectionistic, really high achiever, and lately I've just been having to remind myself, like, I'm human. I'm allowed to like have needs. I'm allowed to not be perfect. I'm allowed to ask for help. And I think it's not, hopefully we've all learned, like, it's not bad to have needs. It's just a fact that we all have different buckets that we need to fill, different needs. It doesn't mean like, oh, you're doing something wrong or that something's wrong with you if you need more nutrients or if you need more than what other people may seem like they need. It just means that you're living and you're alive, and there's never going to be a time that, or a certain age or something, where we're like, oh, okay, now we've arrived. We don't need anything anymore. We have a perfect rhythm down. We've got it. We're just always going to have these needs, so that we're going to like interact with God and engage with people around us, and we always will need to take care of ourselves. I hope that this framework kind of helps you be kind to yourselves and be kind to others, because other people have needs and their needs look different too. And most of all, just acts as a reminder to always take care of yourself.
Well, that's good. Thank you. Yeah. So we wanted to open it up to you guys. So if you have any questions about, we had this special panel. This is like a perfect time to ask any questions about do-overs or about the sermon series. If you're at home, you could type in the chat. We have people who are ready. If you have a question outside, feel free to raise your hand, and Natalie will come around with the microphone. But I don't know, does anybody have a question now? Okay, thank you so much, man. Westlake's so blessed to have such wonderful, insightful, wise people. So thank you. Please give the panel a hand. Thank you so much for sharing and encouraging us as we do this do-over thing. I'll just close this. You guys can. Westlake, you guys have been so courageous, and how I could hear when I talk with some of you about, I'm feeling these feelings. I don't even know if you realize it, but that, it's really hard, and you guys have been so courageous in sharing. And our theme this year is story, and part of our stories is pain, right? Both individual and collective. And pain can be unbelievable. We've seen this. It could be nonsensical. It could be unjust and undeserved. Just in this past week, right? But our experience is that our pain is not just our own. And so rather than denying or minimizing and projecting our pain and brokenness onto others, we have learned in this past month how to embrace our wounds and our pain, and make our way through the pain with the help of our triune God and with the help of one another. We need one another. I love what they shared. Like, we can't do this alone. We were created to go through this and share life with one another. We're not meant to suffer alone. And so I'm going to ask, not suffering, help me think of the worship team, but I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward, and we're going to take communion this morning. Communion is a sacrament that's created to remind us of who Jesus is and what he's done on our behalf. And Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection is the ultimate do-over. And he is the fulfillment of this new covenant that God has with all of humanity. The sacrament was inaugurated the night before Jesus' death on the cross. And Jesus and his disciples were sharing the Passover meal. And Jesus invited them to share in his pain and his suffering. I like to think that maybe, of course, Jesus was preparing his disciples for what was going to happen. But I also think maybe he was preparing himself for what was going to happen. That yes, he was excited that, his resurrection, his death and resurrection was going to bring new joy and new hope and new life, and that he was going to be back with his Father. But maybe he was also grieving that his time, this would be his last meal with his closest friends, that his time on earth was coming to an end, and so he was grieving that. But also maybe his death and his suffering was heavy on his heart and his mind. And I like to think that maybe he invited them to share in what he was feeling when he took the bread and he took the wine, and explain what he was going to go through. That he was embracing the cross and the resurrection. I love how the translation puts Hebrews 12:2, the Passion Translation. It says, "We look away from the natural realm and we focus our attention and expectation onto Jesus, who birthed faith within us and who leads us forward into faith's perfection." His example is this: because his heart was focused on the joy of knowing that you would be his, he endured the agony of the cross and conquered its humiliation, and now sits at the right hand of the throne of God. So as we take communion together, we do it as the church, as a community, and by partaking of the bread and the juice, we share in Christ's pain and suffering and his death on the cross. And we are also sharing in the new life and hope of the resurrection. So on the night of before Jesus' death, he and the disciples laid around the table together. And Jesus took the bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that was broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood. Do this, and as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." For as often as you eat and this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Let's pray.